Hello everyone. So in this video I'm going to talk a bit about politicians in general. Now, I suspect that some people will have seen the title of this video and will be quite reactionary and will come out on the defensive and sort of say, oh, why are you defending them, and so on and so on. I don't want to be misunderstood, so I'd like to just initially state what my position is. I strongly believe in a democracy. People should have freedom of expression. I strongly support the right to criticise politicians. Strongly. I often do it myself. So this is by no means a video whereby I'm saying don't criticise. So I just want to be that to be understood from the outset, just in case that's misinterpreted. I'm not saying that politicians should not be criticised. In a democracy, freedom of expression is paramount and is very healthy that people in a position of power face scrutiny. So that's the first thing. This video is more to do with what I believe is actually a problem with democracy, and that is that people take it for granted. They actually take the sort of rights we have and a sort of they take the context for granted. Let me explain that a little. Quite often I hear people complaining about politicians in democratic countries. You see it all the time on American political videos. You frequently see it on British political videos. You can see it probably on videos from any democratic country. The characteristic of one-party regimes, i.e. non-democracies, that doesn't exist, because quite often there's one source of information and people are constantly fed pro-party propaganda, so the ratio of criticism is much less. And I don't believe that's any genuine love for the ruling party. I think it's because in many situations people don't know any alternative. But I do think that this is more to do with the context of democracy. But I think people take it for granted. They really take the fact that I think, there's a childish aspect to many voters. They seem to think that the purpose of democracy, the purpose of politicians, is to give them what they want. Actually, no, it's not. The purpose of democracy is you will have a selection of candidates who have come from the people, who have stood as candidates, and then you support the candidate you feel whose policies is most aligned to what you agree or disagree with, who you think will make the best job at running the country. And if you don't like any of them, then you don't have to vote. I believe in Switzerland it's mandatory, but in the UK, because that's the situation I can best talk about, it's not mandatory to vote. Obviously it's strongly advised, but you don't have to vote if you don't want to. But I do get a bit fed up of people having this sort of childish concept, which is basically they don't like whoever's in power. Then they make the absurd claim that we're not a democracy because the person they voted for isn't necessarily in power. I am the first to admit that our democracy can always improve. There's areas that are inconsistent, there's areas that aren't entirely fair. It can always improve. So I'm completely open to ideas about democratic reform. But one thing, we have a movement in the UK at the moment called, I think it's Democracy 2015. And I've seen quite a lot of movements like this over the years. And whilst I always have some good points and some important issues to raise, one thing I object about is they always put up this image that it's people versus politicians. Now, some people may need a history lesson. Since the Great Reform Act of 1832, and obviously it hasn't been perfect since then, but in the UK, anybody has the right to run as a political candidate. So the idea that the politicians are not coming from the people is simply wrong. So every elected politician has, before they were a politician, been either a member of society or they've, okay, arguably there's a lot of people who have lived within the Westminster bubble, that is, they've been developed as politicians, but there is actually a lot of MPs who come from different backgrounds. There's MPs who have been soldiers, there's MPs who have experienced a whole range of different social contexts, so to say otherwise is just not presenting the truth. The fact of the matter is anybody over the age of 18 has a right to run as a candidate. So this notion that they don't come from the people, I don't think that's a fair claim. I mean, people are making it sound as if there's this clique of people who are chosen. Now, I do think there's some issues with the way parties maybe choose candidates. I do think there's legitimate questions to be asked about that. And I still think image is a big problem in politics, whereby someone's image is prioritised over their policies. But the media has a large part to blame for that. But I'd like to talk about a range of other issues. I strongly believe that no politician or no party is going to be absolutely right all the time or absolutely wrong all the time. I find that there's partisan people on both sides who will sort of argue that they will just argue against a particular party for the sake of it. Now, I do not support the Conservative Party, which is the ruling party in Britain, in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. They're the majority part of that coalition. I absolutely despise many of their policies. But I would not say I'm 100% against absolutely everything the Tories stand for. Just like David Cameron as a person, I disagree with him on a whole range of issues, but there's other issues I would agree with him on. And when I criticise politicians, my criticism lies in specifically in policies. But one thing I get rather nauseated by is when people criticise politicians for things I believe aren't entirely valid. I thoroughly support the right for people to criticise elected officials for particular policies, because policies impact lives. And if you have major moral issues with a policy, then you're doing something which is in line with your conscience to speak out against that. That's entirely valid. But I get really frustrated when I hear things like, oh, they never listen. Well, you know, when canvassers come to your door at election time and you slam the door in their face and say, oh, I'm not interested, then the very same people turn around and say, oh, politicians never listen. But when they're given the opportunity to speak to politicians, they then turn that around and they don't want to. So if you whinge about politicians not listening, then don't complain about canvassers, because the purpose of canvassing is to galvanise. Yes, it's to encourage support for the party, but it's also to get the sort of to get some knowledge about what public sentiments are. Now, I haven't been a politician per se, but I have done political activism. I've been a member of a mainstream political party. I've done canvassing, and a lot of people, well, I won't say it was all hostile. I'm not going to be completely cynical. Some people actually responded positively. They wanted to speak, they wanted to support the party. But in my experience, a lot of criticism directed towards politicians is not about policy, but about very vague sort of abstract terms like, oh, you never listen. But what they're really saying, I get the impression when people say politicians aren't listening, what they're really saying is that politician doesn't agree with me. You know, the job of a politician is to make clear what their ideology is, what they're going to do in terms of policies, to try and represent their constituents. Granted, some of them don't care as much as they should. Others actually work very hard for their constituents. It depends on the individual. But I don't accept the claim that, you know, I think this claim that politicians don't listen, I'm not saying it's not true. There are circumstances where that's definitely the case, where politicians will give a very sort of they won't answer a question directly. So I understand the criticism there, but I also get the impression a lot of people make that argument simply when a politician has disagreed with them. Now I know if I was asked David Cameron a certain question about, say, unemployment, he's going to disagree with me. And whilst I would have a strong view about his policies, I'm not going to say the man isn't necessarily listening for... I mean, yes, there's definitely circumstances where politicians don't listen. But I think it's a very abstract term, and I do think it's used sometimes simply when a member of the public disagrees with a politician's stance. That is not the same as not listening. That's just because you happen to have a different opinion about what you should think, about what you think the way something should be done. Then there's another absurd claim. You know, I've heard this about Tony Blair, I've heard it about other prime ministers. The absurd claim is they're useless, they've never done anything whilst in power. Now that's simply beyond rubbish. It's just academic laziness. It carries no weight whatsoever. You may not like particular policies, you may think they've been damaging, but that is, again, it's not the same as saying that someone's done nothing. I mean, it does frustrate me that people cannot appreciate the sheer level of pressure a Prime Minister is under. And as much as I have contempt for David Cameron's policies, I would never ever say the man's lazy. I would never say he isn't in a pressurising job, because he very clearly is. You wake up in the morning, you're governing a country. So for people to say that there's no pressure, or, you know, they've done nothing in their time, is absurd. You can argue that the policies they've enacted have been bad policies, have been destructive for the country. But, you know, I think it was Jeremy Clarkson, the racing pundit, he said in 10 years of Tony Blair, all he done was he thinks he opened a road somewhere. And that's just lazy thinking. I mean, Tony Blair's government brought in a smoking ban, a fox hunt ban, he introduced a minimum wage, a huge amount of equality legislation, and yes, there was a lot of negative policies as well, not to mention in foreign policy. But that's just, you know, you'd have to be really stupid to make that sort of claim, because it's just not accurate. I mean, for example, like I said, I have many issues with David Cameron's government, but I'm not going to say in the 2.5 years he's been in power he's done nothing, because it's just not true. I could argue I don't like his policies and I think they're bad policies that are taking the country in the wrong direction, but that is not the same as, you know, most politicians are hard-working people who get into politics because they've seen problems in society and they want to deal with those problems. It's very true that politicians can get corrupted, and there's certainly examples of arrogant politicians. But another claim is they only do it to feather their own nest. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. What exactly does that mean? If you're talking from a financial perspective, a politician's salary is very comfortable, but it's not the vast amounts of money that people make it out to be. An MP in the UK gets, I believe it's 60,000 a year, which is about the same as a doctor. No, wait a second, I'm misquoting that. I think it's 45,000 a year, which is very healthy. I think that's about right. I don't think it should be any more or any less. I think that's about right. But for people to say they do it for money, that's... If they wanted to get into that sort of... If they only want money, they'd become a footballer. They'd become a CEO of a big company. Politicians don't do it for money, because in most democratic countries the pay of politicians is... It's not bad, but it's really not... I don't think they get in it for money. Power, yes, that's a fair argument, and they might get in it for power, but this claim that they're doing it to feather their own nest, that's a rather abstract sort of argument. I'm running out of time on this video. In conclusion, what I'd just like to say is, you know, criticism of politicians is entirely valid, but people have to stop expecting politicians to do everything for them. And they have to recognise that in a democracy, an elected politician is simply not going to be able to please everybody all of the time. The nature of democracy is that politicians represent their constituents, and they've been elected because they've promoted certain policies that people agree or disagree with. The purpose is not to please everyone all the time, and people have to recognise that. I'm not enough time now, so I'll leave it there. That's just some thoughts. Don't expect politicians to do everything, and remember, they're human beings. Cheers.